Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is transit in the Greater Toronto Area, and my guest is Stephen Wickens. He's a retired transportation researcher and urban affairs journalist. He has written for the Globe and Mail, the Financial Post, the Toronto Sun, and the Toronto Star at different times. And Stephen, we last talked 3 years ago, and we talked about the state of transit 3 years ago. What do you think has happened in the 3 years since we talked last?
Nothing good. I will say that we have made some progress on some of the construction jobs, but the Eglinton Crosstown is still not open. We've signed a lot of contracts. We've rushed into a lot of contracts that should not have been signed. The costs of these projects are soaring, and to a large degree, they're soaring out of the sight of the public. We're not making a dent on the public consciousness. Just this past week, a couple of global news reporters had a pretty good story. They got hold of documentation that showed that the costs of the Ontario line have soared 43% since 2022. But that barely scratches the surface of how deep this mess is. And but when we last spoke, we had pretty well established that the costs of these next 4 subway projects in the Toronto area were badly out of control before COVID, before supply chain interruptions, before the latest round of inflation. But those are the excuses being used by the government for
43%.
Yeah.
Put that in dollars. How much is that?
Well, as I said, I don't know that I can put that into dollars specifically in the context of what the global story is, but I think a better way of putting it into context is to point out that in 2017, we opened a subway extension to Vaughan. The TTC had managed that project. It was seen as a scandal because it was more than 50% over budget. But that line was about $380 million a kilometer. What we're doing now with the Ontario line, which was sold to the government and the public as a lower cost way of building subways, is now going to be more than $1 billion a kilometer.
$1 billion a kilometer.
Yeah, and that's a first for Canada. The Ontario line appears to be in a neck and neck race with the Blue Line project in Montreal for the most expensive subway ever built in the history of this country. And we gave Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario responsibility for delivering these projects after what was seen as a fiasco by the TTC, less than a decade ago. But it appears that the TTC was far better equipped to manage these projects than Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario.
So what's gone wrong?
A lot of things. If you go back 40 years when I was really just starting out as a journalist and just starting out with my serious investigations of the transportation realm, there was a guy named Don Morton who was in charge of Toronto's subway expansion. He made the point at the time, because the provincial government was at the start of a period where they were not going to build subways anymore. They gave us the SRT, which we've since shut down. That was going to be a low-cost alternative to subway building. Don Morton at the TTC at that time said, we've spent 40 years building up an incredible amount of expertise in subway building, so much so that people come from other parts of the world to see what we do. And if we don't use it, we're going to lose it. And we've certainly lost it over the past 40 years. I'm not totally down on the idea of public-private partnerships. I think that in some ways, every subway ever built in the world has been a public-private partnership to some degree. But what's happened here is that we have stripped the public sector of the expertise it requires to deliver these projects and to get real value for the public. and Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario appear to be learning on the job, but learning very slowly, and learning in an era when there's an incredible amount of money available, sloshing around, that's attracting a lot of companies that are absolutely not in it for the public good. And who can blame them? I mean, those companies answer to their shareholders, and so they should. I'm one of their shareholders in a couple of instances too.
So the Ontario line is $27.2 billion currently, which you say is a 43% increase from 2 years ago. We've already spent $5 billion in construction costs.
Yeah, it's out of control. The problem, one of the big problems here actually is that of that $27 billion, it's impossible under the current rules to figure out how much is for design, how much is for building cost, how much is for financing, how much is for operations and maintenance. So to do the proper comparisons that researchers and auditors really need, we need far more openness when these contracts are signed, and it's not happening. The government and the agencies are telling us that that type of information is commercially sensitive. So, the public's in the dark, and the government can claim that it's being open and transparent because it does list a lumped sum total on its websites, but it's not really giving us the type of information we need. And openness and transparency is what has helped some jurisdictions wrestle their costs back down and manage things, and allow politicians to make some of the informed decisions that they need to be making. I mean, we can talk all we want about taking politics out of transit, but there is a point at which politicians have to take responsibility. They have to make the final decisions on what we buy, but they can't do any of the comparison shopping. Can you imagine going into a car dealership and people telling you, well, we can't even really tell you how much this car is going to cost because we're going to lump in all your maintenance costs and your operating costs, and you sign on to pay for all this stuff, and then in 20 years or whatever, we'll tell you how much it's going to cost.
So it really was confusing because it said that the contracts awarded that the board reported on included 30-year operations and maintenance contracts.
Yeah.
And so you don't know whether those are in current dollars or in future dollars. You don't know what that covers. So it said that the original budget just for construction was $10.9 billion, but then that doubled to $19 billion when they added in the contracts to operate the line. And now it's far in excess of that. Are we managing these things the right way if we actually, before the thing is even built, negotiate contracts to operate and maintain it?
Probably not. I'm one person, but I've certainly, I'm in contact with a lot of people even in other countries, actually, trying to get a handle on how these costs are working out. And the people that I've come to trust most see it as extremely dangerous to lump in all those operating and maintenance costs. These long-term contracts are subject to a lot of forces that we cannot predict. I mean, if you could have predicted the price of your house 30 years ago, you probably would have bought 5 more houses and made yourself really rich. But you don't. There's no way that most of us can predict what's going to go on, even in the next 6 months or a year, let alone the next 30 years. And to lock yourself into those certain contracts is dangerous to begin with.
So, I'm in the real estate development business, and we enter into leases on a fairly regular basis. And the typical lease will be for 10 years, and we'll have a fixed number. It will escalate at some determination of inflation, and then there'll be an option to renew for maybe another 2 terms of 5 years. So it's a total of 20 years would be typical. But the operating expenses would be charged on top of that.
Yeah.
So that's just the return of capital that is in the fixed lease rate, and all the operating expenses, which would be utilities and property taxes and maintenance charges and garbage pickup and all that kind of stuff, which are typically referred to as common area maintenance charges. There's no way we could predict that for 10 years, let alone for 30 years. And so that is something that the lessee contracts to pick up their proportionate share of.
Yeah.
I can't imagine if you were a company that was trying to enter into a 30-year contract, how you would possibly budget labor, maintenance, garbage, utilities, repair, all that work, and come into a set contract number. What you would do is you would put in so many contingencies that make sure that you've got a return of your capital, return of your expenses, and a return of your profit, that I can imagine the number is outrageously large.
Yeah, it's outrageously large. And I think one of the other problems we have here is that we don't have the expertise when it comes to people negotiating these deals on behalf of the public. The agencies are supposed to be working for the public, at the behest of the government, but working for the public. And we've now appear to have built in a lot of incentives for these agencies to work as much for the people bidding on these contracts as they are, for the public. And so
you think that they're working on behalf of the people bidding? That would be corruption in any other country in the world.
Listen, those are really strong words, but I think that I don't know that it's witting corruption. We're hearing this in the foreign interference scandal in Ottawa right now.
Yeah.
There's witting corruption and there's unwitting corruption. And I think that, certainly for some career purposes, there probably are people who see their long-term prospects as better served by making really good contacts and having good relationships with the bidding companies than they are with serving a public represented by a government that's only going to be in power for 4 years or 8 years or what have you. So to say there's absolute corruption would be to overstep what I know. But what I will say is that people in Ontario are really naive if they think there isn't the opportunity for a lot of corruption to be creeping into this process. There are billions, tens of billions of dollars, which I will say certainly are going unaccounted for. And to think that corruption only happens in Quebec or Italy or Mexico or
is a little naive.
Oh, yeah, more than a little.
Stephen, we got to take a break for some messages, but this is a really interesting and I think a very important question because that we're discussing, because I think that the only way that Toronto is going to work is if we have dramatic increases in transit and therefore in transit investment. We are bordering on becoming a 10 million population greater metropolitan region, rivaling Los Angeles, etc. Mexico, New York, Los Angeles are the 3 biggest cities in North America. Toronto's the next biggest metropolitan city if you think about it from sort of Oshawa to Niagara or Kitchener-Waterloo, contiguous metropolitan area, the way that economists think about metropolitan regions. And if we're going to continue to grow, and some people think that we're adding the population the size of Montreal in the next 10 years, 1.5 million people to the Greater Toronto Area, we've got to have transit because there's no way that we're going to be building highways to get us all to our jobs and to our lives. And if we can't do it economically, if we can't do it reasonably, what are we going to do? We got to take a break, and we'll be back in 2 minutes with Stephen Wickens, a transit expert. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is transit and how the Ontario line has ballooned by 20 something percent, 27% to 43. No, to 27 billion. Sorry, it's increased by 43% to $27 billion. Unbelievable. And our guest is Stephen Wickens, who is a retired transportation specialist and journalist. He's worked for every single major newspaper in the Toronto area, the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the Financial Post, the Sun, etc. And he posts fairly regularly critiques of what's going on in the transit business. Stephen, tell me a little bit about you. How did you get involved in transit and transportation?
I was, I would say, fascinated by the transit system from a really young age. I mean, I was just telling a friend the other day that about a movie theater that's in our neighborhood. It hasn't been a movie theater since the 1960s, but I remember going to see My Fair Lady there with a bunch of kids from the street all piled in the back of a neighbor's convertible. And I was actually much more interested in the subway construction that was going on at Woodbine Station next door, rather than seeing My Fair Lady at the Prince of Wales Theatre. But my whole life, I've just read every story, going right back through the 1960s on public transportation, and I ended up being one of those nerds who likes to read the TTC agenda for every monthly meeting, look at the reports, question things, pester politicians, write about it for media outlets. And I guess it was for me. I'm a retired guy now, and I would love to be able to sort of sit back and feel good that things are in good hands. There are a lot of good people employed by the agencies. There's a lot of good journalists in town, although we certainly don't have enough investigative journalists doing the job these days. But I would love to be able to sit back and just watch intelligent things happen. And unfortunately, I can't let this go because it's painful to see what's happening.
So we did do some things right in Toronto.
Yeah.
I saw this one study that suggested that there was a good comparison between Houston and Toronto, and the same number of people approximately go to work in the central business district in Houston as in Toronto. And Houston has 40 lanes of freeway traffic that lead to the city downtown of Houston, and we've got 12. And so therefore the difference is the GO trains and the subways that bring people downtown. And you can imagine if we tripled the number of freeway lanes that actually access downtown Toronto, how much more parking we'd have, how much more freeway we'd have, how much more climate change, greenhouse gases we'd have, et cetera. And so, we clearly made some right decisions at one point in time. But then I think, as you pointed out in our prior conversation, we started not doing anything for about a generation, 30 years or something, that we were building for a long time, the Yonge Street subway, the University line, the Bloor Danforth line, but then we sort of stopped for quite a long time. We have built this extension to Vaughan. They're talking about an extension to Richmond Hill. This Ontario line is a major new downtown relief line. But do you think, and Crosstown, should be spectacular, but hasn't opened in several years of delay. Do you think that we're learning any lessons? Are we learning the bad lessons and therefore going to get tired of the spending the money and we're going to go back into a generation of no spending? What do you think this current disarray with Eglinton Crosstown overspending on the Vaughan extension and now this debacle with the Ontario line? Where do you think the city of Toronto's collective head is?
Yeah, well, it's the city, the province, even Canada. I think people are losing their faith in our ability to deliver infrastructure, to maintain infrastructure, and to really get value for the public on this. And if we lose that faith, the political will to fund these absolute necessities goes. And along with that goes our ability to compete in a world where some jurisdictions can get their act together. Right now, we have senior levels of government that are really big on, they use this term, building transit. Transit, and a lot of my work in recent years has been focused on infrastructure or, hard things like, the cost of trains or the cost of streetcars and what have you. But the real issue where the rubber meets the road, if you will, is the level of operations. And municipal governments get very little help, if any at all, from senior levels of government when it comes to operations. And it's an important distinction because senior levels of government can promise these expensive infrastructure projects, but rarely do they stick around long enough to deliver them, let alone pay for them. And so right now, we're piling up incredible amounts of debt. There's huge bills that we're going to have to pay. And it's going to be future governments, probably castigated by their opposition in the House, saying, why are you raising taxes? Well, we're raising taxes, they're going to have to say, because you gave us so many bills for these projects. And we are, the English-speaking world in particular, appears to be the worst now at delivering projects on time, at a reasonable price, and delivering projects that maximize the benefits that are available to them.
Stephen, I spoke with a lawyer that was involved in the process at the Eglinton Crosstown at Metrolinx. And this individual told me the problem was our procurement system, and that our politically demanded procurement system that goes for the lowest cost bid all the time meant that what we ended up doing is separating out the contracts into numerous different pieces. They were all the lowest cost. No one had the incentive to work together, and we didn't have lines that met, and electricity lines that didn't meet, and stairways that didn't meet, and tracks that didn't meet, and it was a debacle in the lack of coordination, and that no private developer would build such a development with so many different contracts let out, all at lowest cost, not thinking about having that coordination. What do you think of that criticism? Has it got any truth to it?
There probably is some truth to it, and there certainly would have been some truth to it in the past. I think they've tried to get past it with the consortiums they've put together to handle the bidding. So, for example, in the case of Metrolinx, there's an entity known as Crosslink Solutions that is overseeing the entire project for Metrolinx. But again, we don't have the real guidance coming from public expertise, people who are really looking to defend or even defend the interests of the public, or maximize the value they get back. And it's the public that has to pay for these projects in the end, even if we talk about private sector doing the borrowing, for example. And I would say that in our P3 models, one of our significant problems is that the government isn't doing the borrowing. It's the private sector doing the borrowing. The government can get a better price on borrowed money than the private sector can. So that's one area where P3s are supposed to be designed to have each element is in the realm of the person that, or the entity that is best suited for that, and we're not doing that at all.
So, it's interesting that you think these consortiums work. I've been told that on the Eglinton Crosstown, there's so much litigation between the province, Infrastructure Ontario, Metrolinx, and the providers that things aren't happening because they all have to wait for the outcome of this litigation on all these different contracts that were let. And that's one of the reasons why, if not the most important reason why, we're delayed.
Yeah, I'm certain that is a significant part of it. The I think we had certainly through the 80s, 90s, and aughts, or whatever you want to call the first decade of this century, we had sort of a naive ideological belief that, as long as we turn it over to the private sector, things are going to be more efficient. Um, and there's lots of role for the private sector in these projects, always has been. But the what we're doing now is we don't have the expertise in place demanding the best possible deals for the public, and we blindly embrace this idea that P3s are going to save us, and they're clearly not working. But nobody wants to admit that they're not working. The current model of P3s, and I'm not saying that P3s as a whole are necessarily bad, but the current models.
And you think they're not working because we don't have the quality people, the capable people in the public sector to partner up with? Is that the issue?
Absolutely, yeah. Uh, I think we felt certainly in the 80s and 90s that there's no way that the public sector can do things efficiently or well. But history, if you go back far enough, indicates that yes, they certainly can. So it's we. I don't know how easily we can rebuild that type of expertise in the public sector, but we better find a way because it affects our competitiveness on a global stage.
Let me ask you about this Ontario line. Yonge and Bloor subway station is overcrowded. There's no question about that. And so therefore there's been a talk about a relief line for a long period of time. But no one had ever thought about this Ontario line until it was, ultimately announced. And it seems to be, as you've described, this new technology that we thought was going to be a lot cheaper, but we're tunneling a huge amount of the way. We're going, under the Don River and the Don Valley Parkway.
Actually,
was this Ontario line?
We're going over the Don River.
Over the Don, sorry.
Yeah, that's one of the elevated sections. It's going to be a lot like an amusement park ride, a lot of up and down, and it's snaking through the downtown in a very indirect way. It's going to be interesting to see how all that plays out and how easy it is to maintain that type of line.
Seems like an outrageous amount of money to spend just to relieve some of the pressure at
it's not there just to relieve, and I think that it needs to be much more than that. We need to create a real network of rapid transit through the core. We've an east-west subway line through the core of downtown has been absolutely, it's been overdue really since the mid-1980s. If you look at ridership growth numbers, station usage numbers across the system. And when Bloor-Yonge Station was originally designed, there were a couple of assumptions there that that have ended up being forgotten when we killed off what was then going to be known as the Queen Subway. It was not to be the main interchange station. It was going to be an interchange station. And when it was originally built, actually, we were interlining the Bloor-Danforth with the Yonge University line so that you could get on a train, say at Kiel or Woodbine, and go right downtown or even up to Eglinton without having to change trains at Bloor-Yonge. In fact, there was a hell of a debate going on in the 1970s as to whether we really should be building the extension that went up Spadina and into the median of the Spadina Expressway before building the Queen Line. And the Queen Line got killed off, and then the will to build subway got killed off. We moved to I guess a planning philosophy that we were going to build these suburban downtowns, and as long as we didn't build a subway downtown, these suburban downtowns were going to take off. And it was an interesting theory. It didn't pan out, and we left ourselves in an extreme infrastructure deficit.
The suburban downtowns being what? Scarborough, North York, Etobicoke, etc.?
Yeah, and Mississauga as well. You know, it's funny. I was recently talking with a former Mississauga planner who was saying, if only they'd built Mississauga's downtown a little bit further south, near the Cooksville GO station, it probably would have been much more effective as a downtown, um, rather than trying to put it on a shopping mall that is not already on a railway line. Similarly, in Scarborough, if we put the Scarborough downtown 1 kilometer west, it would have been on the GO line as well. Existing rail networks were severely undervalued, shall we say, for passenger movement when a lot of these decisions were made.
Well, I'd love to chat with you a little bit further about that, because I happen to think that's one of the lost opportunities in transportation, transit planning in the Greater Toronto Area. Let's take a break for some messages and maybe come back and talk about some of those issues. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2 minutes with Stephen Wickens talking about transit in the Greater Toronto Area. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Tonight's topic is transit, and we're chatting with Stephen Wickens, who's a retired transportation consultant, policy nerd, columnist, reporter, analyst, etc. He's written for the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the National Post, the Sun, and he's been somebody that 3 years ago I interviewed, and we talked about the problems in transit. And when we first started talking, he said there hasn't been much improvement since then. So that's kind of
Hey,
negative.
don't forget the report I did as well on the soaring costs of subway building in the GTA. That came out, unfortunately, it came out at the height of the first wave of the COVID pandemic, so it got lost in the news cycle. But which was a bit of a drag for me at the time, because I put a lot of time and effort into that project, only to see it sort of get lost in the news cycle. And yet it turns out it was really useful, because it established that the next subway projects were wildly out of control on the cost side, well before we had the COVID and the supply chain disruptions and the latest round of inflation. And those are excuses that people are getting away with in trying to explain where these costs are going. So
you take a look at what London, England has done with I think it's a circuit that they've built right around all of Greater London, on old abandoned freight rail lines, and even this Crossrail, the Elizabethan line. What they're doing is they're taking existing rail lines and then connecting them through the center of the city that were never connected before. Chicago's doing a lot of work with old freight lines. And certainly John Tory in his first mayoralty campaign talked about smart tracks and using old railway lines. The Lakeshore line that was bought from CN, I don't know, back in the 1960s, when they built the Eastern Freight Bypass to take the Lakeshore freight traffic from Lakeshore up to north of Highway 7 or the 407. I think freed up those lines and made that GO Lakeshore line possible. I've always wondered why it hasn't happened on the CP line. You mentioned Cooksville and the GO line. It's only got traffic going downtown in the morning and out of town in the evening. It doesn't have all day two-way frequent GO train service like you do on the Lakeshore line or on even the Markham line. Why haven't we bought that? The Neptis Foundation did a study, and the Big Move did a study back, a decade ago, that said that it was an 8-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. It had the best return on investment of any transit, they said, in all of North America. Most transit had a 2-to-3 benefit to cost ratio. This one was an 8-to-1. By buying that CP line and or building, on the right of way somehow, and making that Milton Mississauga line all day two-way. And then they went further and talked about how the CP line continues on through the middle of Toronto, north of DuPont, and goes by Casa Loma, the Summerhill LCBO, out to the Science Center, and that it could be Canada, Toronto's Crossrail, equivalent to the Elizabethan line in London, providing sort of a express train service right across Toronto. Why hasn't that been done?
The short answer is that CP doesn't want to sell it. It's an essential piece of infrastructure to CP's goods movement network. And we would have to provide CP with an alternate route for all that freight coming through. CN did that for itself back before a lot of the northern suburbs were built. And but Metrolinx actually didn't acquire that CP or that CN portion of Lakeshore Line until much later when Metrolinx was formed. But yeah, I mean it could be hugely useful if we did have another rail corridor through town. I spoke a little while back with a railway engineer who was talking about, whether we could expand that CP corridor to cover it and put a rail service over top of it, which would then connect with the subway in a few spots, and it could be hugely useful for sure. But yeah, you're right to point out that there's incredible amounts of lost potential on freight lines that go through cities. When CN was able to move its main freight lines and movements to north of the city, it did free up the Lakeshore Line. And we're only now fully expanding that to certainly in the East End now up to 4 tracks. It was they expanded it to 3 tracks about 15 years ago, and now they're going up to 4 tracks for the regional express rail, which I guess is now called GO expansion. People have been talking about that for a long time. In fact, this is the 50th anniversary of a report called SuperGo, which proposed that we electrify and add a lot of stations to the Lakeshore Line. CN, which still owned the line at the time, pretty well put the kibosh on that, but we'd be a lot better off if we had that in place. And certainly if we had an electrified line with much closer station spacing, it could operate like a subway for sure.
Well, what's the benefit of electrifying?
Electrifying allows the trains to accelerate quickly and brake quickly. So, when you're on the subway, those trains are from a standing stop at the station up to speed really quickly, and they blast into stations at high speed and are able to brake quickly. When you're on the GO train, you sometimes hear the clunk, feel the train slowly get rolling, and it takes a long time to get rolling. And those are really heavy trains that take for local, especially, diesel locomotive haul trains take a long time to stop. But you electrify that, you can start running a service that serves a lot more people at the same speeds because you can stop at a lot more stations.
And those stops end up taking a fair amount of time if you're using a diesel
Sure.
train, and with electrification, that stops don't take as long. And I think that there's been some talk about adding a station at the Mr. Christie site, where obviously the Humber Bay area has ballooned in population and development, and is going to go up even more with the Mr. Christie site, 25 acres of land being developed. I understand at one point in time there was talk of a station sort of at Rossesvalles, such that people that were taking the streetcar or the transit Rossesvalles King Queen area could get onto the GO to get downtown in an express fashion. Those kinds of developments I think make a ton of sense, but it seems like we've forgotten them.
We've forgotten them, and I think a lot of people have been lulled into a sense of what the GO system is with its diesel haul trains. I would argue that in a lot of ways, the GO corridors with some expansions and a bunch more stations, if it's electrified, and now we've got the fare integration, which is a big piece of it. GO is in a lot of ways better suited to providing rapid transit connections to downtown Toronto than, say, a Scarborough subway extension. The Milton line, which you raised earlier, has a lot of potential within Toronto as well, not just to connect, say if we added stations at Jane and Keele, um, not just to connect people on a day-to-day basis, but for providing the redundancy when there's a subway shutdown, either for an emergency or for the impending signaling system that has to be upgraded. So many of us endured the Line 1 signaling system upgrade, an awful lot of shutdowns. Well, that's coming to the Bloor Danforth line as well in the near future. The Milton line could be an extremely useful part of that, as could the Lakeshore East line. We have an incredibly long stretch from Main and Danforth right to Union Station without any stations, and we probably should have a station about every 2 kilometers. There's one of the examples, if people are traveling in Germanic Europe, take a look at the S-Bahns in German cities. They've electrified these rail corridors for passenger service, and you've got stations basically every 2 kilometers. And it's a great way of using those old freight corridors on the surface rather than building incredibly expensive tunneled subways in low density areas or lower density areas.
The Neptus Foundation did a big study in 2013, 2014 of our transit and said that, one of the problems was for a city to be a successful economic agglomeration of activities and create the employment and the patents and the activities, et cetera, it's got to be connected, because the whole idea of a city is that you got to be able to connect, businesses and financiers and ideas and universities and et cetera. And they said that we don't connect. And they gave a couple of examples of that. They said that number one, the airport corporate zone, which is the second largest employment zone in all of Canada, couldn't connect or doesn't connect by rapid transit to the downtown financial district. And it went through and it had a couple of examples worldwide of the city of London connecting to Canary Wharf, of La Défense connecting to the Champs-Élysées, of New Jersey and Brooklyn connecting to Manhattan, and said that you needed to have, if you really wanted those two economic engines to be synergistic and to work, you had to have some sort of a rapid transit connection between the two. And then it also talked about how it's difficult to get from Mississauga or Etobicoke to Scarborough, that the two sides of the city are sort of separate worlds. And I've run into this. If somebody invites me to dinner at Scarborough, for 6 o'clock, I say, no way, I'll come for 8, but not 6, because it'll take me forever to get across the city at that time. And I worry about that 97% of all the GO train traffic goes through Union Station. So it's almost like we don't have a network. It's just all centered in one spot. What's the solution to that?
Wow, well, good question. As a lot of people like to say at press conferences, we really do need a serious east-west rail corridor with a lot of stops that does not go through Union. Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier the CP corridor. We probably need something, that connects with the various subway lines that will be in place, over the next decade or so. And I don't know exactly where you would put it, because the way we've allowed our car-dependent suburbs to really take over. I mean, we're going to have to do something really disruptive and something really expensive. Partly because it's one thing to have a big, fast rail line that goes across, but how do people get to the stations along that corridor? Is it going to be enough of an urban context around those stations to really justify that rail corridor? We still haven't really found a way of creating urbanism in our suburban areas. And that's, I think, a key starting point. We spoke earlier about Scarborough's downtown not living up to expectations. Mississauga, I think one of the problems that's faced the one of the problems in Mississauga is that so much of the employment from Mississauga is not in the downtown. It's up at the airport corporate zone, which again isn't particularly well connected to downtown Toronto. So we've built North American cities in an era when we rely heavily on the car, and the car requires that we use an incredible amount of land just for driving and parking. And so it's not just, the buildings might be lower or lot sizes might be bigger. It's the car requires so much of the land that's needed to make a real urban landscape.
So if you had the power to make one or two big changes, what would those one or two big changes in transit be?
I would certainly make entities like Metrolinx report to the legislature as a whole, as opposed to any individual government and its cabinet. I mean, right now, I don't think that Metrolinx should be able to even meet with any members of the Ford government without members of the opposition, or at least official opposition parties in the room. That would be, I think, an important governance starting point. We need real openness and transparency in all of the contracts that we're signing. The Ford government rushed people into signing contracts that are going to be recklessly expensive. But I think also, I'm reminded of that this week because there's a big discussion going on at Toronto City Hall about a push to get the media on side with pestering senior levels of government to buy new subway trains. I think what we really need is to get people who live in areas where they might not use public transit in big numbers to better understand how important public transit is to dealing with congestion, getting people really connected, giving people options. And so we right now, a lot of people can say, well, I never use public transit, so I don't want my tax dollars wasted on public transit. But without serious public transit, your roads are going to be doubly congested.
If not more.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough sell, for a lot of people because people can't see the connection. But the people who do the most to relieve congestion on our roads are the people who get out and use public transit. And I realize that public transit is not an option for a lot of people out in not just the 905, but the outer boroughs of the old city of, or not the old city of Toronto, but metropolitan Toronto with Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough. And a lot of that comes down to service. A lot of the reason that people I've got to drive because public transit stinks. Well, public transit stinks because we don't allow good service to happen, either through lack of funding or through freeing up road space to let those transit vehicles get through.
I think one of the really interesting comments you made is how we've lost some of that expertise because we stopped building for a while. Yeah. And I do think that if we just kept on building, and if we just keep on building, we'll be more successful. I heard this one comment that said we should have a tunneling boring machine and never stop it. Just keep on tunneling. I think that there is a real benefit in institutional knowledge if you just keep on doing something over time. You will build up that expertise. And I worry this stop, go ends up being very problematic. Stephen Wickens, thank you so much for
it's a pleasure, today. And let's try not to make it 3 years next time.
I look forward to chatting with you again, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from downtown Toronto, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are available after the fact on my website, briancrombie.com, and I post my my videos on social media and YouTube. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and all of my podcasts get on several different podcast servers. So there's lots of different ways to listen to the expertise like Stephen Wickens has described today. Thanks so much, everybody. Good night.